Hi everyone. Today we're going to be learning about weathering, erosion, and deposition. These are three processes that shape Earth's crust. So let's hop right in. First off, let's talk about weathering. So weathering is a process where rock is broken down into smaller and smaller pieces. So if we take a look at this diagram, we can see that we have this large rock, this big outcropping of rock. And then we have all these smaller pieces of rock around it. You've probably seen something like this before, but this is exactly what weathering is. It's where rock is broken down into smaller and smaller pieces. I want to point out that weathering happens very, very slowly. Fast weathering would take many hundreds of years. A lot of weathering for very hard types of rock can take millions of years. So what causes this? What causes rock to be broken down? Well, we have what we call the agents of weathering. There's three of them. We have water, wind, and ice. And we're going to take a look at some examples of each one of these types of weathering. So let's take a look at, this is an example of ice doing some weathering. So we start out with this rock here, and we can see that it already has some cracks in it. And these cracks started out much smaller, and some water, maybe during a rainstorm, has seeped into this rock and it's filled up these cracks. And whenever we have this water freeze, water expands when it freezes and it acts like a big wedge. It actually, it's sort of like splitting wood. It's going to actually split this rock apart. Now, it doesn't, this type of weathering doesn't always happen in such a dramatic fashion. Oftentimes, this happens in very small cracks and breaks off very tiny chips. But this is one kind of weathering, and this is called physical weathering, okay, where it's literally pushed apart. Rocks can also weather chemically. And in an instance like this, not all water is just water. Like, for example, rainwater is slightly acidic. All rainwater is. And so acids can dissolve things. And so this would be an example of a softer type of rock. And this rock, when the water falls on it, it actually is dissolved. Some of the rock is dissolved. And over time, as more and more of the rock is dissolved, it's going to break it into smaller pieces. But really, what I need you to remember is weathering is where rock is broken into smaller and smaller pieces. This happens very slowly. Now, we actually have a very particular name for these small pieces of weathered rock, and we're going to call them sediment. This may be a word that you've seen before. You may have seen it as part of another word, like as in sedimentary rocks. But yes, sediment are just these small pieces. So when you see things like sand or silt or clay, a lot of the things that would make up the soil around you, those are all examples of sediment. And sediment is just small pieces of rock that have been weathered off of a larger rock. Okay? Now, let's take a look at our second process. So we have these pieces of rock that have been weathered away, they've been broken off. Um, we're going to talk about a process called erosion. So erosion is where sediment is carried from one place to another. Okay, so clearly we have like this, all of these small pieces of rock that are all down this hill here. And they were broken off of this larger rock up at the top. And this is what erosion is. It's where sediment is carried from one place to another. Now, a lot of these rocks here could have been washed down this slope by water. They could have rolled down when they broke off. That could have happened via gravity. But anytime you have small pieces of rock that are being moved around, we call that erosion. One of the easiest places for us to see this around here is when we get high water, and we're going to have sediment that is going to be carried around by our fast-moving streams. So when we see a lot of mud, a lot of silt, that means that you have like the sediment that is moving from one place to another. So rivers are a good place for us to imagine this movement of this weathered rock, and this is called erosion. Now, something interesting happens during this carrying, during erosion, during this carrying or moving of sediment. So, as the sediment is moved, it's going to collide with other pieces of sediment. During these collisions, we're going to find that the rock is actually going to be worn away. It's going to be polished. If you've ever seen smooth rocks in a stream, this is an example of abrasion. So abrasion is just when rock is going to be worn away because it collided or it scraped against another rock. And oftentimes this is going to provide this is going to make the rock be much, much smoother. But in the end, what we're doing is we're taking away some of that rock. So abrasion happens during erosion, but it is also a type of weathering, right? Because it's further breaking the rock apart into smaller pieces. Many of you don't know what a glacier is. Some of you know that it's related to ice or cold places. A glacier is just a huge chunk of ice that's going to flow slowly downhill. So if we look at this picture, this is an example of a glacier. So, the glacier forms up here at the top, and it slowly is going to be sliding downhill. And these things weigh many, many tons. They are very powerful. We have another glacier over here. So glaciers, as they sort of slide downhill, they're going to pick up chunks of rock. Some of these chunks of rock are small pieces of sediment. Others are huge boulders. This is called plucking. Okay. Now, as these chunks of rock get stuck inside of the ice that's sliding downhill, these begin to act like sandpaper, right? They act like the grains on sandpaper. So they're going to begin scraping against the rock underneath. And so one of the things that glaciers does, a glacier is able to, via the sediment and the boulders it picks up, and as it scrapes along the surface of the rock under it, it's going to smooth them out, right? It's going to create like this really smooth surface, like sandpaper smooths wood. And so glaciers in alpine places, these are really, when we talk about ice being, something that causes weathering and erosion, glaciers are a great example of ice weathering and eroding rock. We said another agent of erosion was the wind. And so, if we take a look at this picture, this is just the wind that's blowing dust. Now, if you have wind that's blowing these small particles of dust in this dust storm, they're of course colliding with other things. And some of the things that they're colliding with is other rock. Hey guys, that's going to be abrasion, right? So when these small particles of rock or small particles of sand or, other pieces of sediment are blown by the wind and they collide, over time, that's going to smooth things out. As you look, some of you may have visited some places that look like this in the American Southwest. Places that are sort of desert-like where they have some high winds. This is some sandstone that was polished by the wind. So sediment being blown sort of through this particular area, this channel has created these very smooth rocks. It's worn away these huge rock structures that are actually quite beautiful. So the last process that we have to think about, right? We had weathering, which breaks the rock apart. We have erosion, which moves the sediment from one place to another. Now we're going to talk about deposition. Deposition is where that sediment just gets dropped, right? So eventually the wind and the water, they run out of energy. They don't move it any further, and they just drop that sediment in a new location. When the sediment stops moving, that's when we have deposition. So these sand dunes are great examples of where wind has dropped sediment, right? These are the tiny particles of sand that have blown up into these huge piles. So sand dunes are a great example of deposition. And so we sometimes say that deposition is where, we have the sediment being laid down, right? So sometimes instead of being dropped, you'll see geologists or people who study the earth use the term that the sediment was laid down in a new location. I feel certain that you've studied these before, probably in social studies. Here we have a stream that was carrying a lot of sediment, but as that stream moves slower and slower as it gets further away from the headwaters, it's going to begin dropping the sediment, right? And so this is a river delta. And this entire area all out through here is the delta. This is all the sediment that's been washed downstream and it's been dropped or deposited here. So river deltas, another great example of deposition. So guys, try to keep in mind that through weathering, erosion, and deposition, these agents, water, wind, and ice, they cause drastic changes over long periods of time to Earth's surface. If you've ever visited the Colorado River, I think there's no better place to sort of get a feel for how powerful these processes are. So this is the Colorado. This picture is of the Grand Canyon, and this is the Colorado River down in the bottom of it. Over many millions of years, as this river has been flowing, it's been carving down off into the rock. The sediment has abraded its way down in through the rock, and it has made this really deep sort of canyon. And so, if you think about this, this is like many, many feet deep, but this river has produced like these huge changes in Earth's surface. Okay. Um, Try to keep in mind too that this is really a process that's happening. If we think globally, it's a process that is happening all the time. We have, we're going to have like mountains. We're going to start with some mountains, and the mountains are going to be broken down by both weathering and erosion, and they're going to get smaller. So as the mountains are broken down, these valleys are going to fill with the sediment, right? Some of that sediment is going to be carried away by the streams that flow down off into the valleys. And over time, though, the mountains could be leveled. Now we're talking over many millions of years, but we can start with mountains and end up with a flat surface again. And then, so one of the things that we have to learn about in the future is, okay, where did the mountains come from? Because if this was true, if this is a cycle that's happening all the time, why isn't the surf completely flat? Okay. All right, guys, I hope you have a great day, and we'll continue learning about the geosphere and the processes that shape it soon.